Test is on chapters 34 through 39. 34 goes all the way back to the 1920s. Right? So the test basically starts with the 1920s and goes through the 1940s. It goes through the 1940s. Now, in terms of the 1920s, we handle the 1920s from two sort of vantages. First, we looked at the cultural, conflict that defined the era. And you basically wrote a paper on that. We said, look, during the 1920s, there was the emergence of what we call new and changing attitudes. And these new and changing attitudes included sort of different ways to look at, gender, ideas about race, circumstances, scientific notions that seem to assault religious notions. And so there were a lot of ideas that collectively fall under the category of modernity, modern ideas, that conflicted with traditional ideas. And, we talked a lot about that, you wrote about that in your papers, but in chapter 34 in your textbook, some of these things are sort of discussed. And one of the things that's discussed that some of you, but not many of you, wrote about was something called the Red Scare. Now, in terms of the Red Scare was the first of two periods of time in which Americans became absolutely convinced that there was an internal threat of a communist overthrow of the U.S. government. So the Red Scare, red stands for communism, right? Red is the color of communism. And so the Red Scare was kind of a fanatical belief that there were things happening in the United States that represented a potential communist conspiracy to overthrow the U.S. government. The first Red Scare is in the 1920s, 1919 to 1921 approximately. The second Red Scare is in the late 1940s into the 1950s. The second Red Scare is usually associated with what we call McCarthyism. Right? Now, the first Red Scare, the one in the 20s, was a result of the Bolshevik Revolution. If you remember, in 1917, in 1917, in November of 17, Lenin and the Bolsheviks took over Russia, renamed the country the Soviet Union, and established for the first time a government and a society that was an economy in particular that was based on communistic ideas. This is the first communistic state. Now, Americans believed that the Bolsheviks, the Russians, were intent on spreading communism to the United States. Now, why did they believe that? And that's sort of the Red Scare, that this Bolshevik revolution in Russia was going to spread to the United States. Now, does anybody remember reading anything about this? I mean, what made them think this? I mean, what made them think that there was actually a threat of communism? I mean, did they just wake up one morning and say, oh, it happened there, it's going to happen here? I mean, anybody remember anything about it? Yes?
Didn't people in America some took a liking to this, I guess the ideas of communism?
Yes, there were supporters. There were supporters of communism in America. And consider this, the Red Scare is to some extent a function of xenophobia. Xenophobia means fear of foreigners, right? And so you had, people, after the war was over, the influx of immigrants that had been going on prior to the war resumed. And so you have people from Russia, you have people from Germany, you have people from Eastern European countries who are supporters, or at least perceived supporters, of communism. And the other thing that you had was a rash of labor disputes, strikes. Lots of strikes, some of them violent, and people sort of concluded that, look, the commies are inspiring workers to sort of overthrow the government. You had some also pretty famous bombings, some bombings that were maybe perpetuated by some radical factions, but for one reason or another, there was this belief, which is called the Red Scare, the first Red Scare, that Communism there was a communist insurrection afoot. Now, one of the biggest manifestations of that was something called the Palmer Raids. The Palmer Raids. And they were in January of 1920. Mitchell Palmer, who was the Attorney General under Wilson, who was still the president in January of 20. Because remember, the presidential election is not going to be till November. Claimed, and Mitchell Palmer actually wanted to be president himself, claimed that there was a communist insurrection afoot, that this was going to happen, and that he, the Attorney General, would go out and arrest and deport all of the troublemakers. So, in and around somewhere in January, may have been early January, he went out, his agents raided all these places where they thought that communists were holed up, and arrested these people and deported many of them. And the Palmer Raids is sort of a manifestation of the Red Scare. And the Red Scare in general is considered to be a manifestation. The xenophobia associated with it, the fear of new ideas, is one of the manifestations of the cultural conflict. Business people exploited this. The business people that wanted to break up unions said these unions are communist inspired. And communism sort of means more because of the Bolshevik Revolution. Now, besides the Red Scare, another manifestation, and most of you wrote about this in your paper, of the cultural conflict of the 20s was the emergence of the Ku Klux Klan. And the Ku Klux Klan of the 1920s was different than the Ku Klux Klan of Reconstruction. Remember, the first time the Klan formed, it formed in response to radical Reconstruction. And radical Reconstruction was that time period of Reconstruction where radical Republicans dominated Congress enough to force upon the South, right, to force upon the South, Republican governments that enfranchised and embraced African Americans, scallywags and carpetbaggers into these state governments. And we said that many white people responded to this during Reconstruction by forming vigilante organizations to attempt to intimidate and overthrow those governments. And that was the first Ku Klux Klan. The first Ku Klux Klan faded when radical Reconstruction died. Oh, what was the event that killed radical Reconstruction? I know this is not in the test, but we are preparing for a big AP test. Does anybody remember when radical Reconstruction is 1867 to 1877? The event that signifies the end of it was what? Anybody besides go there?
Is that the impeachment?
Not the impeachment. Not the impeachment. Yes, go ahead.
Wasn't it when Cleveland took the troops out of the South?
Not Cleveland. Who took the troops out of the South? Rutherford B. Hayes. We call it the Compromise of 77. When Rutherford B. Hayes is elected to the presidency, that gigantic controversy about counting what ballots, and eventually the compromise that allows Hayes to be president, ends with him withdrawing troops from the South. Kelly, do you recall that now?
Oh, yeah.
Yes. Now, the second rise of the Ku Klux Klan was 1915. And the second rise of the Ku Klux Klan was a response to several things. It was a response to the Great Black Migration. The Great Black Migration, as we mentioned before, was when large numbers of African Americans are going to leave the South to go to northern cities to work in factories during World War I. It was a response to a huge influx of immigrants. It was a response to, particularly from Southern and Eastern Europe, it was a response to new scientific ideas that minimized the importance of religion. It was in response to sort of changing gender roles and the automobile. I mean, the Ku Klux Klan was absolutely, positively a backlash against the elements that were considered to be a part of modern urban America. The flapper, the immigrant, the African American, everything that was the Catholic, the Jew, everything that was considered to be inconsistent with what was traditionally American. And many of you, wrote about and read articles about the Klan and what they specifically said and what they were about. So it's a different organization in the 1920s than it was in Reconstruction. Another manifestation of the traditional America's backlash is the immigration restriction legislation that was passed in the 1920s. For the first time